Within the city of Key West, there are building height limits, those relevant top limits being 25, 30, or 35 feet, depending upon location. Staff from the city's planning department are researching a potential ballot question that will allow buildings located within flood zones to be elevated above these height restrictions. If presented and approved, buildings would be allowed to exceed the height restriction by 1 foot on the top for each foot added to the bottom, with a maximum allowance of up to 4 feet above minimum flood levels. This presentation seeks to explain the intent of this effort. During the next several years, flood insurance costs will rise significantly. During the same time, flood levels upon which these rates are based are also expected to increase. Consider also the effects of climate change upon rising sea levels, and it becomes clear the time for planning is now. Buildings constructed long before flood maps even existed were often built at or close to ground level. When flood insurance maps became effective during the mid-1970s, many such buildings were deemed below expected minimum flood levels. Today, these buildings' owners pay dramatically higher rates for flood insurance. Due to recent flood insurance reforms, those already high rates will continue to increase upwards of 18% a year. One of the most effective methods of preventing future flood losses is to elevate these buildings, yet current height restrictions might not allow such elevation to occur. As an example, we'll use a 2-story residence built at ground level long before the flood maps existed. We'll say it's located in an AE6 flood zone and was determined to be 3 feet below the flood level. Ideally, if this home were to be elevated above this flood level, it should be lifted higher than just the minimum expected flood. When elevating a building, each foot above minimum flood level, which is referred to as freeboard, further protects the home and dramatically reduces yearly costs for flood insurance. The maximum savings comes with 3 feet of freeboard. Yet when this house is elevated to the most advantageous level within an area governed by a 25-foot height limit, it may exceed that height restriction. If presented and approved, this referendum would allow such buildings to exceed the height limit by the number of feet needed to reach the flood level, plus up to 4 feet of freeboard. So, for each foot added to the bottom, the elevation of this home would be allowed to exceed the height limit at the top by the same amount. This allowance would be limited to a maximum of 4 feet above the flood level for any location. Overall building height would be limited to a maximum of 40 feet measured from the crown of the road. This limitation will be regardless of how many feet may be necessary to elevate a building to the minimum flood level or provide any freeboard. To clarify this important point, we'll use an example of what would not be allowed. Let's say a homeowner with a house 3 feet below the flood level wants to elevate the building those 3 feet plus add an additional 4 feet of freeboard for a total elevation of 7 feet. But if adding 7 feet to the bottom of the building would cause the top to measure 42 feet, that's 2 feet beyond the maximum cap, then only 5 feet could be added to the bottom. This height allowance would also apply to newly constructed buildings, encouraging freeboard for those as well. A less desirable option would be for owners to opt for flat roofs in an attempt to add freeboard to the bottom without exceeding the height limit at the top. Flat roofs are more expensive to insure and more susceptible to wind damage. FEMA has advised the city to anticipate new flood maps around 2019. These new maps are expected to have a 1-foot increase in flood levels to some, if not all, zones. Thus, a building elevated today could very well be rated 1 foot lower in a few short years. Therefore, when elevating a building, it would be prudent now to plan for 1 extra foot beyond a targeted height so a loss of benefits doesn't occur when this 1 foot increase becomes effective. Today's regulations regarding the use of enclosed areas below flood levels wouldn't change. Such enclosed areas could only be used for minimal storage, parking, or access to the upper levels. This limitation on usage applies to any freeboard area as well. Such areas created by adding freeboard couldn't be used for habitation. This action would only apply to buildings within a regulated flood zone, which are zones beginning with the letters A or V. Buildings within an unregulated flood zone, known as X zones, wouldn't be affected by this action. The only X zones in the city are located downtown, surrounding the Solaris Hill area, shown on this map as the 2 shaded zones. Buildings within the historic district would still need that commission's approval to elevate a building higher than the minimum flood levels, meaning any amount of freeboard would need HARC approval. Current building height restrictions vary by zoning district. Generally, these are the historic, single-family, and commercial zones. Within the historic district, along with neighborhoods zoned for multifamily residences, the height restriction varies between 30 to 35 feet. Some of these zoning districts allow variances for an additional 5 feet of uninhabited space, such as for peaked roofs. In the single-family residential districts, building height is limited to 25 feet, with an additional 5 feet, again with a variance for uninhabited space. Certain Newtown commercial zones have a 40-foot limitation on building height. However, these commercial zones won't be addressed here, as they will remain unaffected by this referendum. Unaffected because under this referendum, no building would be permitted to be higher than 40 feet. For more information on the potential savings for elevated buildings, check out our Benefits to Elevation and Freeboard video.